say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over. And I've seen the promised land.
This is the Kathleen Wells Show. I'm Kathleen, your host. And you were just listening to one of the speeches that Martin Luther King gave. I think that one's called To the Mountaintop. I can't remember. I could be wrong. But I'm excited to have my guest, Michael Long, because he has actually annotated a collection of letters written by Bayard Rustin. And those letters are annotated and collected in his book, I Must Resist, Bayard Rustin's Life in Letters. And he's going to tell us who Bayard Rustin is and how important and influential and significant he is to the civil rights movement and how influential he is to Martin Luther King's life and his activism. So, Michael, thank you for joining me on the Kathleen Wells Show.
Kathleen, it's great to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
You're very, very welcome. So the first thing I want to say to you, the book where you've collected and annotated the letters of Bayard Rustin's Life and Letters is called I Must Resist, Bayard Rustin's Life and Letters. It's marvelous. Tell listeners who Bayard Rustin is.
Well, you just played a speech by Dr. King. That was his last speech that he made in Memphis. It was his last speech, I believe, that he ever made, but right on the night before he was assassinated. A really moving speech. And just to give you an idea of who Bayard was to Dr. King, after Dr. King was assassinated, Rustin traveled to Memphis and organized and led a memorial march for his good friend, Dr. King. The two of them went way back. They went back to February of 1956 when King was helping to lead the Montgomery bus boycott. Bayard traveled down Montgomery at the invitation of some of his friends and colleagues in New York. He was working with the Fellowship of Reconciliation, an interfaith pacifist organization at that point. And when he went down to Montgomery, he discovered that Dr. King, was not really as nonviolent as Bayard wanted him to be. He saw guns lying around in Dr. King's house. Dr. King had armed bodyguards guarding his property and his family at the same time. And Bayard really was the one early on who encouraged King to embrace nonviolence, not only as a tactic, but also as a way of life. So even from those early days, Bayard played a really hugely influential and meaningful role in King's life.
And in fact, Mr. Rustin was a pacifist. Isn't that correct?
Rustin was a pacifist, that is correct. He was an active member of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. He was on FOR staff. His pacifism had its roots in lessons he learned from his grandmother in Westchester, Pennsylvania. She had been reared by Quakers. She had been schooled by Quakers. And she took that lesson from the Quaker heritage about the nonviolence of Jesus and the importance of remaining nonviolent in the face of conflict, and passed that on to young Bayard. He was really open to that lesson. I'll say that as well. He was open to that lesson. He embraced that lesson fully and remained nonviolent for a big part of his life. She taught him many things. She was a wonderful woman. He considered her, quote, a dealer in relieving misery. She passed on so many good lessons to him, including the lesson from the black church that they attended in Westchester. They attended the AME, the local AME church in Westchester. And Julia taught Sunday school there. Julia Rustin and Bayard's grandmother taught Sunday school there. And she focused on the Hebrew lessons of the Israelites being led out of slavery by Moses. And she loved that lesson, and she passed that on to Bayard as well. So she passed on a couple things. One was his nonviolence. She passed that on to Bayard. But she also passed on that key lesson about the need to free slaves right here and right now, and the need to join God in helping the slaves become free, not waiting to sometime in heaven. Julie had a really earthly spirituality, and Bayard picked up on that.
So tell me, Michael, what motivated you to collect his letters and put them in a form of a book? What was your inspiration?
Good question, Kathleen.
Yeah.
Rustin is really the confluence of so many of my interests. I study 20th century politics and religion, and in Bayard's life, so many of my interests come together. There's nonviolence in Bayard. There is pacifism. There is democratic socialism. He's a democratic socialist. He's African American. He's a radical in many ways. Later, he picks up LGBT issues. He's on the forefront of most progressive movements in the 20th century. And so that really attracted me to Bayard. And when I started reading his letters, I thought, wow, this is the guy I really want to focus on, because he had not only all that, but he had this beautiful artistic expression about him as well. And so he's personally attractive because of that, but he's also politically and religiously attractive to me, too.
So explain how a collection and analysis of his individual letters, his personal correspondence, tells his biography, and also it has allowed you to feel sort of intimate with him, to feel as if you know him personally,
right,
like a good friend or a brother.
Well, the nice thing about letter writing at this point in history is that, at least in Bayard's life, it's really revelatory. And remember, these people aren't writing brief emails. They're not firing off texts. Bayard and his colleagues are sitting down and writing letters that take thought and contemplation and even meditation in certain points. A lot of his letters, for example, come from his days in prison. And I think those are some of the most revealing. So what I love about letters in general, and Bayard's in particular, is that they really reveal his innermost thoughts. And so we're getting him in many ways in an unfiltered way, in his own voice. And so we can picture him sitting down in a lonely jail cell, for example, and writing a letter, and then imagine that, wow, here's Bayard Rustin and his innermost character. And you don't always get that when you might see him in footage at the March on Washington or at other marches, and people commenting, news commentators, for example, commenting on that. When you read these letters, you get a really nice insight into his innermost thoughts and into his heart, really.
And so your book, I Must Resist, Bayard Rustin's Life and Letters, includes hundreds of his letters. Tell me, how did you decide which letters you would include in the book and which ones you would exclude?
Right. There were some that certainly didn't get in. But I wanted to show Bayard's different sides. I wanted to show his personal side. I wanted to show his humor, for example. I wanted to focus on his gay sexuality, so I wanted to make sure that that was included in the letter collection. I also wanted to make sure that the letter collection focused on his politics. He was political to the bone. And when you read some of the strategic letters in the book, for example, you can see how much of a strategic thinker he was. So I wanted to show that dimension. I also wanted to show, though, that he was spiritual in the deepest recesses of his heart. It's easy to look at Bayard Rustin's life and conceive of him as just a political animal, but this is a guy who's driven by spirituality as well. So I wanted to make sure I included that in the book. And then finally, I wanted to make sure that I included some of his artistic inclinations, his love of music, his love of art, his love of antiques, and canes, for example. So there were these different perspectives or these different parts of Rustin's big character, his big personality that I wanted to be sure to include. And then I wanted to do it chronologically, beginning in the 1940s and then ending with the demise of his life in the late 1980s.
Now, I just read that the Senate has now approved Obama to strike Syria. Now, tell me, what would Bayard Rustin, now he was a pacifist, he believed in nonviolent resistance. What were his thoughts about war? And at that time, we were in the Vietnam War. What would be what was his thoughts about war and that type of, the ultimate? And in fact, didn't Martin Luther King say America is the purveyor of violence?
The greatest purveyor of violence on earth. Yeah, that's exactly what King said. King said that America is the greatest purveyor of violence on earth. Rustin never said anything quite like that, but I can tell you that in World War II, he refused to serve as a soldier. He also refused to serve as a medic. He also refused to go to camps for conscientious objectors called CPS camps, civilian public service camps. And so in World War II, because of his pacifist convictions, he decided that he would go to jail. And that's what he did. That's where he spent his days during World War II, in jail. And while he was in the federal prison system, he spent a lot of time trying to desegregate it. Bayard always had a cause. So even in prison, he takes up the cause of desegregation. He tries to desegregate the federal prison system. But he was opposed to war, and he states this in one of his early letters about World War II, that he's opposed to it because it conflicts with his understanding of Jesus' teachings of nonviolence and what he calls at this point the brotherhood of man. And of course, that language is we consider now sexist, but he's talking about the human family and the unity of the human family, which was a basic Quaker principle. And because he believed in that, and because he believed that the inner spark, the spark of the divine, resided in everybody. He had no justifiable reason to kill anybody. And so Bayard was a pacifist in World War II. In Vietnam, he opposed the war, though he did not assume a leading role in the peace movement, and that really irritated a lot of his radical pacifist friends. We can talk about why later if you'd like, but he was opposed to the Vietnam War too. I have a feeling, though I don't know for sure, it's always fraught with difficulty to predict what somebody who's deceased would say about a problem now. Mm-hmm. But if he remained a pacifist, Bayard would certainly oppose military action against Syria, right? So in the 1970s, it gets a little complicated, Kathleen, here, because Bayard favored sending military jets to Israel so that Israel could protect itself. Boy, he's a complicated character, isn't he? But
he's a complicated character, and I also think that it's very difficult to see, to assess individuals' characters in sort of like in a flash, to take a snapshot of it.
Right.
And I think you do try to show that in your book, how people evolve and they change and they're a little complicated and they're nuanced, because things have evolved. We've gotten different information with the advent of the internet. We know more, information travels quicker. So we know more now than we did back then. So Does that make it? So it's hard to say that he would necessarily, because I'm definitely, I have a program on Saturday called Palestine Today. So I definitely go for the underdog. Do you know what I mean?
Right, yeah.
And it's hard for me to see Israel being the fourth largest military in the world as the underdog.
Right.
So yeah, I just don't want to think that, he would be for the fourth largest military in the world, a pacifist. I can't believe that. But, we can go
yes,
on.
I do know exactly what you're talking about. And people do evolve and change their beliefs across their lifetime. And Bayard actually commented on his own character at one point by saying character is a matter of judgment across a whole lifetime. Mm-hmm. And he said this, Kathleen, right after Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina went to the Senate floor just before the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom and called Bayard Rustin a sexual pervert. Mm-hmm. And the media responded to that in part by asking Rustin what he thought of the senator's vile comments. And Rustin said, look, character is a matter of judgment across the spectrum of a life. You can see who I am at X point, but also look at who I am before then and who I am after that as well. And look at all the different things I do. Don't look at just my sexuality. Look at my politics. Look at my civil engagement and so forth and so on. Look at my spirituality. So, yeah, he made the same point that you're making.
Right. And so actually he was the architect, is that the right word? The architect of the 1963 March for Freedom and Justice, for Jobs and Justice, the March on Washington for Jobs and Justice, which we just celebrated last week, the 50th anniversary.
Yes, that is a fair characterization. He was the brilliant architect of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. That's the title of the march, and I'm glad you focused on jobs because as a democratic socialist, Rustin wanted to make sure that they just didn't talk about racial desegregation or integration, but also about the need for jobs. But yes, Rustin organized that march along with a brilliant staff as well in 8 short weeks. 8 short weeks. Imagine how long it takes many of us to plan weddings, for example. He did the March on Washington in 8 short weeks. Unbelievable. Now,
miraculous, yeah.
Yeah. Now he was chosen to do that
without email. How can you do it? Without cell phone.
Well, there were some great shots of his headquarters in Harlem, and they were constantly working on the phones. They're constantly typing. They're constantly shouting from floor to floor. It was a busy beehive. There's no doubt about that. Yeah, without email, it's remarkable, isn't it?
It's remarkable. So in the letter that he wrote to Coretta Scott King in 1983, he said that it's not a time for, 1963 was a time for hope, but 1983 is a time for a feeling of despair. In other words, he was saying we should not be marching. Mm-hmm. So that sort of goes to what I'm saying also about the Palestinians versus the Israeli conflict, that given this, everything must be looked in context. So things change. And yet, we are still marching. But in 1983, that is when the war on drugs, that's around the time that the war on drugs started. So I just can't help but feel that he would think that marching, like he wrote Coretta Scott King, is no longer an effective means of protest.
Isn't that interesting? Rustin raised a lot of flags about the 1983 march. He was concerned about backlash. He was concerned about not enough people showing up for the march. He was concerned about security issues for those who marched. He was concerned about funding for the march as well. And really that was his job as a strategic thinker to raise up caution flags. But by this point, Rustin had moved in many ways from what he calls from protest to politics. He wrote a famous article along with Tom Kahn called From Protest to Politics. And he's really calling for his fellow movement leaders to think about moving off the street at certain points. Now, he continues to march the rest of his life, Kathleen. I want to emphasize that. He does not give up protest. He does not give up marching on the streets. He does that the rest of his life. But he wants to encourage his fellow movement leaders to think about moving into corridors of power so that they can access the money and resources they need for achieving a massive redistribution of wealth so that poor folks can get a better opportunity at a good life in the United States. And he believes that that's going to happen only if movement leaders begin to move off the street and into corridors of power where they become political leaders, not just movement leaders, but leaders of the polis. It's a controversial move, and a lot of people still don't like that part about Rustin, but there it is.
But there it is. So you're saying moving into corridors of power. Well, what's the ultimate corridor of power? The White House. Mm-hmm. So what do you think So what do you think he would think about President Obama?
Well, I would think that, again, it's probably difficulty to imagine what somebody who's deceased would say today. But I will say that I can't imagine that he wouldn't think that the presence of an African American in the White House is the result of a strategy of moving from protest to politics. I mean, this is what Rustin had been calling for since the mid-1960s, for African Americans and other movement leaders to take control of political structures so that they can move wealth to the poor folks. Has that happened? I don't want to comment on the Obama presidency, but just the fact that there's an African American in the White House, I think Rustin would see as the result of a strategy of moving from protest to politics. I think he'd be surprised, too, that it happened as soon. I know it sounds strange to say, but as soon as it has in light of his call for that to happen.
Well, we're going to take a break now. If anyone knows him well, you do, because you've sort of breathe life back into him through reading his letters, and you're conveying that to us. So when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about the fact that he isn't well known, and why isn't he well known when we talk about the civil rights movement. So we're going to talk about that. Also, I want to open up the phone lines. If there are listeners out there that have a question for Michael Long about the civil rights movement, about Bayard Rustin, please feel free to call 888-909-1050. That's 888-909-1050. So I'm speaking with Michael Long, who has written a book called what is your book? Say your book. I'm sorry.
I Must Resist, Bayard Rustin's Life and Letters.
Thank you. Fantastic.
Sure.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is Kathleen Wells. This is the Kathleen Wells Show. My guest is Michael Long, and Michael Long has provided in his book, I Must Resist, Bayard Rustin's Life in Letters, a marvelously annotated collection of Rustin's letters. And in this book, he explains the spirit and evolutions of the thoughts and actions of an often overlooked key figure in the 20th century civil and human rights movement. So, my question, Michael, why was Bayard Rustin overlooked?
Well, several reasons, I think, Kathleen. He was never the head of a major civil rights organization, especially early on. Unlike Dr. King, for example, he wasn't the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or unlike Roy Wilkins, he wasn't the head of the NAACP. He also wasn't a major leader in the black church, like Adam Clayton Powell, for example, or unlike Adam Clayton Powell, Rustin also wasn't a political leader. So those were the traditional venues, I think, that scholars and journalists and others tended to look at when they looked at the civil rights movement. They tended to look at the church, they tended to look at civil rights organizations, and they tended to look at politics. And Rustin wasn't a leader in any of those. He was always behind the scenes, not always, but often behind the scenes. He was behind the scenes for a couple different reasons, too. One of them was the fact that he had roots in the Communist Party. He was a member of the Young Communist League in the late 1930s. And I think that movement leaders were concerned about that getting out, and they tried to keep him in their shadows because of that. But quite frankly, they were also concerned about Rustin's sexuality, too. He was as open as a gay man could be at this point in U.S. history, and that didn't sit well with some of his colleagues in the civil rights movement, especially conservative Baptist ministers. And so they tended to want to keep Rustin in the shadows for that reason, too. And Rustin had been arrested on morals charges in 1953 in California. And so he had an arrest record that people were concerned about. So for a variety of reasons, he was kept in the shadows of civil rights movement leaders.
You know, it's hard for me to believe, looking back, thinking back, that any gay person could be out in the open in the 1950s. I just can't even imagine that.
Well, he's not marching down the streets with a flag, that's for sure. But if somebody wonders, he certainly doesn't deny who he is. And as I understand it, if you knew Rustin, you knew that he was gay. So he was somebody who wasn't out to hide his sexuality. But at this point, quite frankly, he's also, not marching in the street about gay sexuality either, or gay rights. That doesn't happen until the late 1980s for Rustin.
Oh, not until the late 1980s. So, and also, you say that you write that he had a relationship with, an interaction, a dynamic with Malcolm X. You want to elaborate on that?
Sure. Well, to tell the full story, I need to go back and talk a little bit about Rustin and Dr. King in 1960. So in 1960, Rustin gets Dr. King and the great labor leader A. Philip Randolph together to announce at a press conference that they're going to hold marches against the Democratic and Republican national conventions that summer. It's a brilliant idea. And when Representative Adam Clayton Powell of Harlem, he gets wind of this, he is not too keen on the idea. In fact, he wants to squelch it for a variety of reasons. And so he has an intermediary called Dr. King with a threat, and the threat is this: if you don't stop the march on the Democrats, I'll go to the media and tell them that you're having an affair with Bayard Rustin. Well, Dr. King is not a profile on courage on this point in 1960, and he runs scared a bit. He's concerned about being irrevocably tainted by Rustin's sexuality. And so after a while, he and others decide to cut Rustin out of the inner circle of advisors for Dr. King. And it crushes Rustin. He's hurt. He's devastated by that decision in many ways. But during this period, he continues to do what he can. And he engages in public debates with Malcolm X. And Rustin is battling with Malcolm X for the soul of the civil rights movement. In many ways, Rustin is part of the old guard of the civil rights movement, and so he is calling for racial integration. He's calling for the use of nonviolence and the pursuit of racial integration, and stands against or opposed to Malcolm X on both of these points. And so they engage in a series of public debates. But by June 1964, Rustin starts to refuse to debate Malcolm X. And the reason for this is that just before Rustin says this, Malcolm X had called for African Americans to form rifle clubs when they believed and knew that the police officers in their communities weren't protecting them. And Rustin believes that call made by Malcolm X is so far outside the mainstream of the civil rights movement that he should no longer even debate Malcolm. And so from June 1964 on, they don't debate. And I wish they had, but they don't.
It's so interesting because, going through all of his papers, his personal correspondence, all of his letters, didn't you feel like you wanted to have a conversation with him?
Oh, yes, indeed. In fact, I did as many searches as I could to listen to interviews of Rustin so that I could listen to his cadence, listen to the passion that he used when he spoke and what passion he had, listen to his humor. He was a humorous guy as well, and listen to his anger. And sometimes he was very angry. There's no doubt about that. I also talked to his friends and colleagues in the movement. including his longtime companion, Walter Nagel, for the last 10 years of his life, and got some personal insights that way as well. But yes, I'm sorry that I never met him.
Well, so later on, after Martin Luther King's death, he became involved in many campaigns, many protests, and one specifically was to protest the construction of the nuclear bomb at Los Alamos.
Yes. Yeah. And I can back up and talk a little bit about that. Rustin had been protesting nuclear weapons for a long time. So in 1957, for example, he became a key founding member of something called the Committee for Nonviolent Action. And the purpose of the committee was to use direct action campaigns against the deployment and testing of nuclear weapons. So in April 1958, Rustin travels to London. He speaks to a crowd of 5,000 anti-nuke demonstrators, and then he joins them, and thousands of them, on a 50-mile-long march to Aldermaston, which was the site of Britain's atomic weapons research establishment. Now, I think his best campaign happens in 1959. He travels to the Algerian Sahara. Believe it or not, this project is called the Sahara Project, and its purpose was to protest France's construction of a nuclear weapons testing site in the Algerian Sahara. France had the horrible idea that not only would they colonize Africa, but they would also detonate their first nuclear bomb there. And so Rustin and his fellow radical pacifists, in Great Britain especially, developed this plan, and the plan calls for their group to enter French territory and head toward the testing site. And so what they do, Kathleen, believe it or not, is that they organize a nonviolent invasion of the Algerian Sahara so that France won't detonate its nuclear bomb there. Well, it fails, because in February of 1960, France does indeed explode its first nuclear bomb on African soil. It's a horrible injustice. But before that happened, Rustin and his colleagues did indeed draw the world's attention to that horrible spectacle. And then from there on, Rustin continued to protest nuclear weapons the rest of his life. He thought they were absolutely horrible. They killed masses of people indiscriminately. And that kind of action stood against Rustin's Quaker principles.
Yeah, and see, this is why I think that he would be opposed to a strike on Syria. This is why I think he would be disappointed with Obama's action. Despite the symbolism of having the first black president, I think he would oppose this strike on Syria. In fact, I think he would oppose the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, all of our incursions into the Middle East. I mean, these are my notions. This is how I feel, because naturally I want to think that he and I would be on the same accord. Anti-war, anti-violence, for those who are disenfranchised, those who are underprivileged, those who do not have jobs. So, those.
Much of Rustin's life, yes.
Yeah, I just want to believe that.
Yeah,
Don't
I
you?
do too. I want to see a trajectory like that. I really do. Much of Rustin's life was dedicated to those principles that you just outlined.
Those whose voices are least heard, which is the Palestinians today, not the Israelis. Go ahead.
Well, Rustin was a big advocate of refugees without voices later in his life, and he devoted so much time to traveling to refugee camps and meeting children and singing with children and trying to bring a little morale to the group, and then trying to get governments to help refugees. And he traveled the globe on behalf of refugees who did not have voices. So I think it's important for us to remember that, too, as we think about these other issues that you're mentioning. Absolutely.
And, in fact, there's something like 22 million Syrian refugees now. They've crossed the border. So, I don't know. It's complicated. It's complicated. My position, I'm anti-war, period.
Right.
I'm anti-war, period. It's just destruction.
If Rustin remained anti-war, absolutely, he would be opposed. Yes.
So it was interesting. I mean, because he was a pacifist, and yet he believed in arming Israel.
Israel. Yeah.
So that is, people are complicated, right?
Oh, my gosh. Yeah, and Rustin especially. Yeah, Rustin especially. Yeah, many people, not many, but several people have asked me to try to make sense of that, and I don't know what to say. I talked to his colleagues about this. Rochelle Horowitz was a close friend of Bayard, and she worked with him on the march, and she was with Bayard for a number of years. And she said that he felt some guilt and shame about not helping Jewish victims as much as he could have during World War II, and this is one way that he was compensating or overcompensating for that. I'm just passing on the message, but that was the way that Rochelle Horowitz explained that blip, that significant blip on the screen of Rustin's life.
Yeah, because he didn't fight. He was a conscientious objector. Was he technically? Yeah. To the war, yes. World War II. He did not fight in that war. He decided, So maybe he had some, so that was sort of like a blip, like you said. I would like to think that.
He opposed World War II. He opposed the Korean War. He opposed the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm. And, another thing is that some places, like I know you have to view everything within context, because you can find Martin Luther King even showing support for Israel, the state of Israel.
Yeah.
Their letters or speeches or something where he expresses that support. However, I think if he were alive today and we were to ask him, I think both Martin Luther King, this is what I want to believe, Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin would be for the Palestinian people who are being ethnic. I would love to believe that.
Well, another interesting dimension to the issue of Rustin and King in context is that some of their supporters were liberal Jewish activists in New York, and they felt great support for the civil rights movement from these activists, and felt the need as well to return the favor to causes that they supported, to liberal causes that they supported along the way. So, I'm not trying to explain things away. I'm just trying to read these guys in context.
Understand them fully.
Yeah.
And in context, exactly.
Right.
And back then, things were different. So, things were different. Yeah, things were different, right?
Yeah,
and so,
absolutely they were.
Yeah, they were different. And so it's all very complicated, and people are complex, and some things are gray. They're just not black and white. So also, later on in the 80s, Rustin criticized President Reagan's proposed cuts to social welfare programs.
Oh, that's exactly right. And that seems to make a world of sense to me in light of the rest of his life. Rustin was a democratic socialist with the roots in the Communist Party. He always believed that there should be a massive redistribution of wealth and supported social democratic states and democratic socialist states along the way. And so when Reagan came along and started to call for cutbacks in those types of programs that benefited the people whom Bayard had tried to help his entire life, Rustin was hurt and angry about that. Absolutely.
And he was a member of the Communist Party. I also know that Paul Robeson was a member of the Communist Party. Can you imagine back then being black and being gay and being a member of the Communist Party? I mean, Go ahead.
What's interesting is that Rustin became active in the Young Communist League in the late 1930s because it was one of the few groups agitating for racial justice. And so when Rustin joined the YCL, he agitated for racial justice through the Young Communist League. And he grew upset when the communists turned their perspective and focus onto fighting fascism. And when they did that at that point in World War II, early on, even earlier before that, they asked Rustin to stop agitating for racial justice. And he felt used and abused, and he never went back to the communists after that. But yeah, here's another interesting point about Robeson and Rustin. They sang together on Broadway in a musical called John Henry in the late 1930s. So
wow.
They knew each other early on as well. And Rustin had a great deal of respect for Robeson.
Well, what a colorful figure. Well, let me ask you, Michael, what background do you have that you would, what is your background? I want to just say it like that because this is very fascinating, these figures in history that we don't know enough about. And often these black figures in American history, we as Americans don't know enough about them. And so I'm delighted that you've taken the time to collect these letters. What is your background in?
Well, that's a good question. The question, I think, is why do I study people like this? And I don't know the whole answer other than to say that I grew up in a home that was socially concerned, and my parents were very compassionate and often taught me that it was important to be friends with everybody, not just the popular kids in school, but especially those who were on the margins. And that lesson really stuck with me throughout my whole life. And I suppose I have my parents to thank for this. And so I've devoted a lot of my scholarship along the way to focusing on people who have been in the margins. And I also choose folks like this so that my sons, I have two sons now, so that my sons will learn about some of the great heroes in U.S. history that they would not otherwise learn about, and so that they can look at U.S. history through a perspective that's different than what they learn in middle school and high school, where you learn about history through wars. You go from one war to the other, often, not all the time, but often. And so I want to introduce figures who are on the underside of history to my sons so that they can be inspired to carry the mantle forward.
Yeah, that's very wonderful because that's like I just saw recently Oliver Stone's documentary, The Untold History of America. I think I'm saying the title correctly. And often history is told by the victor.
Right.
And so central characters are left out, are not highlighted. In fact, I just saw some information that said that Texas is now trying to rewrite history and not characterize the period of slavery as slavery, but to call it something like the triangular period or something, I can't remember, but some strange thing. They're not going to use the word slavery anymore in the public schools in Texas.
I'll have to check that out, but that sounds absolutely abhorrent to me. Let's call things for what they are. The good thing about Rustin is that he always spoke in very plain and clear language. And I encourage all your listeners to go to YouTube or some social media channel and to listen to Bayard speak. It's really dramatic in many ways.
Oh, I encourage people to do that also. And
the other thing I'd like to...
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
The other thing I really want to add, Kathleen, is that President Obama has just announced that he will be awarding Rustin posthumously the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And Rustin will receive that award in November. And that's really remarkable because at one point the U.S. government, conducted surveillance of Rustin's life. And it's significant because the government had targeted him as an enemy who needed to be spied on. So now Rustin is coming out of the shadows and is beginning to be a celebrated figure. And that shows some growth of our country. And I'm really grateful for that as well. I'm glad to see him get this. I'll be glad to see him be awarded this posthumously, this award in November. I'm also glad that his papers are deposited at the Library of Congress. He is, in my estimation, a national hero, a national icon. And so I'm glad Rustin has traveled this journey from being somebody who was spied on to somebody whose papers newspapers are treasured by the government. It's wonderful to see the irony of history.
How we've come full circle. Well, we're going to take a break. Come back from the break. I want to talk about the landmark decision, Bowers versus Hardwick, which Rustin wrote a dissent, or he registered his dissent to the United States Supreme Court. So when we come back from the break, we're going to go over that case real quick, okay? We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Kathleen Wells Show. I'm Kathleen Wells, and my guest today is Michael Long, who has his book, I Must Resist, Bayard Rustin's Life and Letters. This book provides a fascinating insight into Bayard Rustin's activist life. It includes hundreds of letters in Rustin's own words that reveal his tireless and brave efforts to promote American civil rights, as well as his personal tragedies. All aspects of Rustin's experiences are captured in these letters, including his struggles with opponents dedicated to silencing him as an international symbol of nonviolent protest against racial injustice. So, Michael, question. Towards the end of his life, Bayard Rustin wrote a dissent to the United States Supreme Court regarding the landmark decision in the landmark decision, Bowers versus Hardwick, which made illegal gays having sex in their private homes. Do you want to talk on that? We've got, 4 more minutes.
4 more minutes, sure, yeah. So at the end of June 1986, the Supreme Court decided the case of Bowers v. Hardwick, as you know, and Byron White, the Justice Byron White, argued that homosexuals did not have a fundamental right to engage in acts of consensual sodomy. The LGBT community was, as you might imagine, very disturbed by the ruling, and Rustin was as well. And so in mid-July, he writes a letter that talks about the decision, and he says this: I feel strongly that the Supreme Court's recent decision in the case of Bowers v. Hardwick is a retreat from its record of protecting the privacy of individuals. I believe that it poses a threat to the freedom of all Americans, and that it sets the stage for renewed attacks on our liberties by extremists who would have everyone conform to their own definition of moral and ethical behavior. By this point in Rustin's life, he begins to speak out about LGBT rights. Now, he had earlier stated that his sexuality was a private matter, and he didn't take part in the early gay rights movement, later the LGBT movement. He didn't take part in that. He wasn't an early leader in that movement at all. But at this point in his life, he's in a relationship with Walter Nagel, his longtime companion the last 10 years of his life. And Walter starts to encourage Bayard to speak out on behalf of LGBT rights. And we have Walter to thank in many ways for helping Bayard see the importance of this issue. And so Rustin starts to take some really interesting stances on LGBT issues, including that stance on Bowers v. Hardwick. Rustin begins to attend LGBT events. He also goes to the New York Borough and pleads for them to pass legislation that's gay-friendly. And he also says that the LGBT issue is really the new civil rights issue. It's the new human rights issue that people should gather around and support. So by the end of his life, he's a huge LGBT rights advocate.
Well, I'm so delighted that you've taken the time to do this book, I Must Resist, Bayard Rustin's Life and Letters. I want to encourage all my listeners to get this annotated collection of Rustin's letters by Michael Long, I Must Resist, Bayard Rustin's Life and Letters. Bayard Rustin was an architect of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Thank you very much for joining me, Michael. You're always welcome to come back on to discuss anything you'd like to discuss. Your next book, what will be your next book?
Oh, I'm working on a book on Franklin Cammony, an early gay rights leader who commented a lot on Bowers v. Hardwick. So stay tuned, and thank you so much, Kathleen. You were a delightful host.
Thank you very much, and we'll hear you soon with that book. So thank you, Michael, for joining me. I Must Resist, Bayard Rustin's Life and Letters. Please go out and get it. Thank you. See you next week.